This is a new series we're doing on the book of Esther, and Esther is a fantastic book. It's so much more depth to it, as most of the Bible is, than just on the surface. You know, many times you hear the book of Esther and you're like, oh, great women's Bible study, let's do that, you know? And so like you're thinking, I've gone through the Esther women's series, and I'm a guy, and should I be here right now? Yes, absolutely. The book of Esther was not written just for a group of ladies, but it was written for a whole people of Israel, God's chosen people, and it's so much depth to it about how God saves a nation, and God redeems a nation, and God has sovereignty and control over all of life, and no matter what happens, no matter what life can throw at you, God is still in control. And this book has tremendous application for us today. And I think one that I hope you'll pull from this. And so a couple things as we go through the book of Esther, I would encourage you guys to do as well. Read Esther. If you can, if you've got a couple of hours, you know, read Esther in one sitting. I don't even think it'll take you a couple hours. Maybe take you maybe not even an hour. But even the whole purpose behind Esther is that the children of Israel at the Feast of Purim, they would read through the book of Esther every single festival every year. And so when they went through it, they would read it just to be a good reminder of how God saved their people and how God redeems them. And so I think as you read it as a whole in its entirety, but also kind of dig into the meat of it. We've got a couple of commentaries on the website that if you want to read further and dig deeper, that are fantastic resources just to study into Esther. But today we're going to talk specifically about the facade of the world. So Esther 1, it sets the stage for all the rest of Esther. And so in the great Persian kingdom, I mean, this place is massive, it's mighty, it's powerful. And I wanted to kind of bring up just a point as we talk about this. It's January, so now it's the beginning of tax season, right? Everybody can get excited about that one. Just kidding. But tax season is one of those things where you just can't avoid. Taxes come, you have to pay them, you have to file them. And being in a clergy, minister, taxes, it seems like that is the most convoluted tax system out there. So every year, I feel like I'm always confused. Me and Lindsay always feel like we don't do things quite right. Some years we owe like way too much, you know, and it's just been a pain in the butt. And every time we go through our taxes and through tax season, it's like, how can we like avoid this, or how can we change this or make it better? Good luck trying to change taxes. In fact, even calling the IRS, you know, you may be on the line for like 30 minutes, an hour, just trying to talk to somebody. And it brings up this really important point. If you want to change something in government, there's a way in America we can do that. You can talk to your elected official, or you can be very active in the vote process. But you think about how many steps have to go in place before actually something gets changed. Right? You talk to an elected official, or you vote in a new guy, and then they have to go bring in Congress involved in that, and then they go and then talk to the IRS chief, or then whoever, and then maybe this one customer service guy on the phone that was maybe a jerk to you. How do you deal with that situation? You got to go through 10,000 channels, right? And so what happens is this guy never gets dealt with. You never work on the customer service side of the IRS because it's way too difficult to get anything accomplished in those small levels, right, of government. Now think Persian kingdom. Xerxes ruled Persia with an iron fist, right? This was his government. This was his kingdom. And if you wanted to change something, well, good luck. You probably weren't going to have that change. And if you tried to suggest a change, it may mean your execution. Because you didn't question the king, right? Even I think, even in our mindset of just with the government that we have today, there's a process in place to see change happen. But in Persia, there is no possibility to change things, and so Esther 1 really sets the stage here of this whole idea of the world, and Persia represented so many things. Right? I mean, Persia conquered Babylon. Babylon at that time was a known power. Persia is vast. The army is just, I mean, the kingdom is humongous. Any type of vice or any type of thing that you want to purchase, you've got it all at your fingertips in Persia. Persia is incredibly wealthy. Inside of the king's treasury is just full of golden tablets and golden coins, and it's just wealth upon wealth upon wealth upon wealth. Persia has everything. And so this is huge. I mean, this is huge in their day. It's huge in their day and time. And if you were to go up against Persia, unless you were Greece, which, they wind up actually stopping them, defeating them. Everybody was scared to death because of the amount of armies that Persia could send at you and throw at you. And so this was a vast kingdom, fearfully frightening place. And that's the setting of Esther 1. It kind of brings up this whole idea of all the traditional things, money, wealth, power, fame. Persia's got it all. So let's look into Esther chapter 1, and we're going to look down into verse 1. Now in the day of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict, there is no compulsion. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. And we're going to stop there and then we'll continue on. So what you have here is this guy named King Ahasuerus in Greek. His name would be Xerxes. If you've seen the movie 300, and they kind of, the way they represent Xerxes is this really tall guy, and he's just massive, and he's got some crazy ninja warriors and stuff like that in his army and stuff like that. I don't know if that's true, but he at very, very least had huge armies, and Xerxes was the ruler over this kingdom, very famous king. He had a couple of kings before him. His father Darius. So he was very significant. Also, Cyrus. Cyrus is the one that conquered Babylon and also allowed the Israelites to become citizens of Persia, no longer slaves of the kingdom. So there's all kinds of things that happen because of that. Ezra is a commission to go build the temple and go back to Jerusalem, build a temple. Then you have even Nehemiah's commissioned by Artaxerxes, Xerxes' son, to go rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. So as far as Israel goes, very favorable. Last week we talked about the exile and how Israel was in slavery for 70 years. And now they're at this point where even though they don't own their own kingdom, right? Persia is in control. Persia is in control of the whole thing. Persia is still very favorable to the children of Israel. So it's not a bad environment, technically speaking, compared to what they had gone through already. This isn't as bad, right? And so they're in this place, and Persia, this picture, it's painted here of this guy named Ahasuerus. In the Hebrew, it kind of sounds like Akasharus or Akasharos or something like that. And so this guy, his name in the Hebrew transliteration kind of sounds like King Headache. So it doesn't have like a meaning directly out of Hebrew in that name. It's a transliteration. But it kind of sounds like kind of King Headache. So there's some things going on here in the book of Esther from a genre perspective, that it's a book that's meant to be read as a narrative. If you're reading a novel and you go through it and you read through it, sometimes you'll catch some little funny puns. It's like saying, if there's somebody and it was stupid and I called him Rupid, right? That's kind of how this kind of sounds here, right? It's a name that kind of sounds like it. You kind of get that off the name of the guy. So Ahasuerus, he ruled from 486 BC to 465 BC. We're going to be posting a map on the website, kind of what the kingdom looked like. Esther defines provinces at 127. This is probably like some type of smaller geographical provinces. We realize that the Persian kingdom was ruled by what's called satraps or satraps. And they were individual kind of like nation states, all part of the kingdom of Persia. And they would have a governor over each nation state. And that governor, that noble, his responsibility was to raise taxes, to help build up the army there. So when you go to manage this massive kingdom, you need people to kind of help manage that kingdom. And so we see that he employs very administratively gifted in the way of running this huge kingdom by these satraps. So he's got this huge kingdom, and Susa was one of the 4 capital cities. Also, Ecbatana, Babylon, and Persepolis were the other 3. This was a very hot place, and so this was kind of his summer kingdom. He's going to hang out in the summer in Susa, where it's nice, or in the winter, where it's nice and warm there, because he wanted to get away from the heat or the cool, so he goes in Susa. And we see that there is incredible opulence in Susa. What Xerxes does is he brings the nobles, the governors, and generals all around for 180 days. Now, what's going on context-wise is that Persia is about to try to reinvade Greece. Again, this is the context of the 300, where they go and Spartans, and they stop them, and they have this epic, battle, and don't completely stop them, but they finish them off, later. So what's going on here is that for 180 days, he's bringing the nobles, he's bringing the generals, and what he's doing is he's taking them on a tour around the place, tour around Persia. He's like, guys, let me show you what we got here. Let me show you my treasury. Shows them around. I'm sure it wows them, right? Whoa, I've never seen that much money in my life. You imagine it's like kind of walking into some sultan's house, some oil tycoon or something like that in Saudi Arabia or something. Like, wow, this is incredible. Look how much stuff is here. That's what Xerxes is doing. He's kind of showing off all his riches, showing off all his kingdom, maybe showing off how trained his armies are, probably showing them things they've never seen before in their lives. Xerxes has it all, and he's doing a tour for 180 days. That's half a year that he's just showing them around his kingdom. Talk about an ego trip for this guy. Xerxes wanted to show what he had and to show how awesome that he thought he was and how awesome his kingdom was. Just showing off, right? And we see not only does he show off there, but he also shows off at the end with this 7-day banquet. Everybody present in Susa, the citadel, anybody is welcome to come in, and they throw this humongous party. And what does he say about the wine? He says there's no compulsion. Basically, you drink as much as you want in verse 8. Talks about that. Drink as much as you want, as much wine as you want. People are getting drunk, and all these things are going on. And what partially in context of the story here is that in Persia, that when they got intoxicated so much, they thought they were closer to God, and they would even make battle plans while intoxicated. And then they would kind of go and look over them again and make sure that they were, great way to lead an army, right? Let's just get drunk and let's come up with some plans, guys. You've got a crayon, trying to mark something out, right? Probably not a great idea to make battle plans out, but this is what they did. And they make all the battle plans out. This is what's going on. It even shows that some things that they have going on here in verse 6. It talks about the white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Anything that you could get that was wealthy, they had it. Right? And I think as a representation, if you're reading this in context from when it was probably written, this is probably after the invasion of Greece. We realize that they were defeated. Mighty Persia was defeated. And so there's a huge irony going on here in chapter 1, where it's showing that even though all this might, all this power, all this wealth, all these riches of Persia, they were defeated by little Greece. When you see the landmass of Persia and you see the landmass of Greece at that time, Greece was tiny, right? They were little. And I think what's going on here is just setting the stage and remember, Esther, it's kind of one of those books where God is kind of working behind the scenes of redemption of his people. And so his name, in fact, is not mentioned one time in the book of Esther, although God is present all throughout the book. And this is part of it. God takes the powerful, the mighty, all the impressive things of the world, and he uses those things to bring himself glory by bringing those things to their knees and crippling them. Right? Little Greece destroying mighty Persia. Right? How does that work? How do you stop the defeat of the onslaught of Persia? Or how does it work? Because when God's in control, there's no king, there's no power, there's no empire that can stand within his might. Right? Nothing, no riches. None of that impresses God. right? That's the things that we're impressed with. You know, we see a lot of wealth, we see a lot of power, we see a lot of might. You know, the world esteems wealth, pleasure, and fame, right? He had it all. Xerxes had all. He has this humongous harem. He's got everything. All that any man would ever in a fleshly sense want, right? He's got it. And yet none of that brings him any security, any stability, because God is in control of it all. You know, we often will let these things of wealth, of pleasure, of fame be our guiding forces that help us make decisions and help us kind of say, okay, this is what we're after in life. None of those things will ever bring you joy. None of those things will ever bring you happiness, anything that's lasting, and it'll always leave you empty. And the truth is because the God that we serve, God, Yahweh, the creator of all, the whole universe, has everything in his hand. I mean, he created the universe by speaking it into existence. That's the power and the might of God, right? That's who God is. And so when that is the God we worship, nothing else matters. Nothing else, if you think about it, if God wanted, could ever hurt us if God didn't want it to happen. Now, he often lets those things happen. We talk about suffering, and we talk about all different kinds of things like that. But if God didn't want it to happen, it wouldn't. Because God is in complete control of the entire universe. Right? So the might of Persia, and all impressive as that is nothing compared to God. Let's look down into verse 10. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, so he's good and drunk by this point, right? 7 days of drinking nonstop. He's good here. When the heart of the king was merry with wine, he committed Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. So Queen Vashti was that name in Babylonian, we think, kind of has this meaning, this idea of blessed or beautiful one. So a very beautiful woman, probably. Again, Xerxes only had the best that he could find, and so it made sense that the queen would be the most beautiful woman in the kingdom, and he was proud of it, right? He spent 180 days showing off all these nobles and governors and everything else, and now he wants to show off his wife. Right? I'm going to show off my queen. Let me just show you everything I got, right? And he's good and drunk, so that's probably not the best time to make decisions, but here he is. I'm going to show off my queen. So he goes and gets these eunuchs to come in. By the way, eunuchs are castrated men. I don't know why completely why they did that, but partially that was they put those guys in control of their kids or their harem. Well, if you castrated guys, there's no fear of that there would be any kind of temptation there with the harem or anything else like that. And so these eunuchs were a part of the royal court. They would help guide Xerxes on matters of finance, of strategy for war, of all different aspects, right? And these guys were there. And he gets them to go in and bring in Queen Vashti. And what does Queen Vashti do? She knows Xerxes has been drinking for 7 days, and she's like, no, I'm not going to be delivered so you can parade me around, and probably the 7 guys, they could have been, they're carrying her around in one of those little things where the woman sits on top of it and they kind of walk around with it. I can't remember the name of the thing, but they probably want to walk around with this. And she's like, "No, I'm not gonna show off. I'm not gonna show off my beauty." This is kind of interesting, and even of itself, just in the sense of this culture. And a couple things as we read this kind of story, and even in Esther, that we have to be really careful of. When you read this, you can kind of say, Queen Vashti, it seems like made a good decision, and I think. Obviously, I think she was the one that was probably the most level-headed one in the book of Esther. But the book of Esther doesn't give us a sense of, very direct, from a narrative standpoint, morality, who made the good decision, who made a bad decision. So you see Xerxes make some questionable decisions. Even Esther, you see her make some questionable decisions. And you think, who was the one that was right, who was the one that's wrong, and just the overall tone and context of the story. I don't believe that whoever wrote Esther, that was their intention, of trying to give you the overall moral, put yourself in this person's shoes kind of story. Does that make sense? You ever read a story or watch a movie, and you immediately identify with one of the characters? And you're like, oh man, I feel like I'm like that guy, or I'm like this girl, or I'm like, whoever. And you want to identify with one of those people because that person has maybe a similar story to you, or maybe personality-wise you seem to connect on. Esther is not a book where we should try to identify with one of the specific characters in that sense and kind of determine moral tone and character and quality and things like that. Esther, again, in the grand scheme of things, is about how God redeems and saves his people, how God is in control of the entire universe and how his people are the backdrop of how he preserves them and how he redeems them. And so just be careful when you read that, is to read into that. And I bring that up now because as we introduce new characters, I think there's a temptation to do that. And so just make sure you're not reading yourself into one of the characters here. But anyways, Xerxes is not very happy. And in fact, in verse 12, it says that at this, the king became enraged and his anger burned within him. Xerxes is one of those guys where if there's anybody you don't want to make angry, it would be him, right? At his disposal, he could do whatever he wanted to you. And what's going on here is that the story is being set. So when we get into Esther and what the dilemma Esther was up against, we realize that it's very tough to oppose the king. You don't oppose the king. That's something in Persia that should be life lesson number one. If you want to live and do well in Persia, don't oppose the king. Right? Queen Vashti breaks that cardinal rule right here in 10 through 12. And so we see that the world rules through ego and pride. And we see that's one of the many themes of Esther is this whole idea of pride. Xerxes wants to show around all his stuff, right? And pride is one of those motivators for us that often gets in the way of our flesh, right? When we rule through ego and pride, when we make decisions based on our own pride or our own ego, you're always making terrible decisions. Even if it winds up being, a good thing at the end of the day, that's a terrible motive to make any decision that's based on your ego and pride. Because if your pride's hurt, you just do some stupid stuff. You ever watched the show Shark Tank? Me and Lindsay love that show. Just really got into it recently, and we've been kind of thinking like, I wonder if we come up with an idea that's like blah, 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 or whatever. Anyways, well, on those guys, these guys are billionaires, right? And they have the biggest egos and the biggest pride you've ever seen. Like Mark Cuban owns the Dallas Mavericks. And anytime you kind of shun one of those guys or you hurt their pride, all of a sudden the deal just gets canceled. They don't think rationally anymore. It's all emotional. It's all my pride is hurt, and so now I'm going to lash out. Making decisions based on your ego and pride are terrible decisions or terrible decision factors for us, but it's one that we do all the time. And here we see that example from Xerxes. Let's look down into verse 13. So what happens to Vashti? 13, it says, "And the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment, the men next to him being Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom, according to the law, because what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs. Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and his officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, and they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day the noblewomen of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath and plenty. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in his own script, and to every people in his own language, that every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. So the king and the princes and everybody around, nobody's happy with what Queen Vashti did. You refuse the king. This is terrible. The king wants to bring in his princes, and he brings in his princes and says, okay, what do you think should be done here? And he says, well, these guys know the times, they know the language, they know the law. The princes and the eunuchs, that's what they did. They studied the law. And a lot of times the law was kind of like, well, it's the interpretation of the law, and they would interpret whatever they wanted to at the time. Here, I think probably is an example of that. I doubt they had this law on the books. What happens when the queen refuses you? What do you do? Kind of thing. And so they just kind of come up with something. They say, well, if everybody hears what Queen Vashti did, then all the men, all the husbands in the household are going to have an uproar because all their wives are not going to be submissive anymore, and it's going to be chaos, right? That's kind of funny, and you even see the humor in that, and it's written in Esther. So first of all, only the people in Susa were there present at this banquet, but they send this decree out to the ends of the Persian kingdom. So if you didn't hear about what Queen Vashti did before, you did now, because everybody knew. And so the irony there is just huge. Tells everybody at the ends of the kingdom, and this whole thing of pride, right? Pride's hurt, ego's hurt. We want to defend our pride, we want to defend our ego, so we are going to try to scare them and realize, hey, you don't step up against your husband, whatever. And so out from that, right, is this Queen Vashti is no longer in that royal position as queen. And princes say, okay, we now are going to look for another queen who is better than her. And by better, they mean more submissive, right? So let's get a more submissive lady in here that's going to listen to you, and it's going to be better. And everybody will realize this is what happens when you mess with the king. You may get the boot out the door, right? And so Vashti is no longer allowed in the presence of the king again. And so there's this whole idea of response to the king and the court is the world controls through fear, intimidation, and force. This is how you would roll in a kingdom like that, is that someone were to hurt your pride or ego, you'd make sure that they knew their place, right? You cast them down, you kick them out. You would make sure they knew, or you chop off their head or do some kind of other crazy thing. People in the ancient Near East had all types of interesting ways to kill you. They were very creative in the ways of killing you and taking your life. And this is what was going on in the kingdom. And so what's going on here in the context of Esther is that it's setting the stage providentially. Had Queen Vashti never been, had this whole thing happen, right? Would Esther have been brought to the surface, right? These seemingly coincidences that happen all throughout. This happens, and this affects this, and then this affects this, and then this affects this. And then God's sovereignty and in control over seemingly coincidental things. I probably, if I were to ask you in this room today, how did you get here to Redemption Church? And even just what brought you here. Some of you maybe not from this state. Some of you are. And if I were to talk to you just how all that stuff worked out, you'd probably have this crazy story. And I bet there wouldn't be one story that'd be the same in the room. Because God's providence, which is the theme all throughout Esther, is that God works through seemingly inconsequential things, the everyday, the ordinary, that we just tend to neglect or we tend to overlook and think, there's no way that God could be in that. And yet God knows exactly what he's doing at the right time, in the right place, and we're just kind of looking in, at almost like this really in-depth view of our day and time, but we can't see the whole picture. I think Anselm talks about God being the great parade watcher, right? He could stand back and see all of time and see all of it, space and time, all at the same time, right? Everything. And we talked this in community group this past week, how God sees it all. He knows it all and is in control of it all. And as we let those little coincidences and we let those little ordinary things that we just freak out about, we worry, we have anxiety, and God's the whole time is saying, I've got it. I'm in control. I've got the whole thing. Right? And you just watch this whole process in Esther of one thing after another, after another, after another. Right? This girl who lost her mom and dad, who is in this foreign land, And she gets elevated to this point of queen. There's nothing in her character that we see from the book of Esther that says she's this really righteous or outstanding person. She's just a really pretty girl that got exalted to queen. And yet God uses every aspect of that, even down to her very physical appearance, of putting her in place. Right? Just think about that. Everything about you that God has done and created, he's in control of it all. The way that he's created you, the way that he's created me, the way that he's created time and space, and the way that he moves everything according to his purposes and plans. It's an amazing thing to think about that God is in control over it all. But yet, it's his, and he has it, and it's in his hand. It's an amazing thing. And we'll just watch as you go through the book of Esther and just see that each one of these things are major crises that take place. And yet God's in control every step of the way. God's moving. God's in work. And God's doing the same thing for his people. You know, as the church, if you are a follower of Christ, if you've repented and believed in Christ, and you're one of his people, you're a follower of him, right? God works in our lives. God works in the lives of the church. You know, when you see things like persecution going on all across the world, and you think, how can this happen? When you see injustice happen all across the world, how can this happen? And yet God uses his people to help redeem his people, and he uses us in evangelism. He uses us in solving injustice and working through those things. But God is in control of it all. And no matter how chaotic everything appears, and no matter how chaotic everything seems, God is in control of it all. No matter what power is around, no matter how much riches, wealth, and influence and authority, no matter how much fear and intimidation and force they try to use, God is in control. And so for some of you today, that may mean that you've never accepted Christ as your Savior and looking to God as the Lord of your life. I'd ask you today, if you're not a follower of Christ, and maybe you kind of are afraid of this, like, is God really in control? Does he really have it all together? He does. And maybe for you, that's just acknowledging that Jesus died on the cross for your sin, that Jesus is the one that redeems you from the biggest problem you've ever faced, which is your sin. And that he has redeemed you from that and you've realized what he's done on the cross for you, and you need to accept his forgiveness of grace. Others of you today may be in that boat where you're just like, you know what? I just have a hard time seeing how God's in control of this. I have a hard time seeing how God's in control of that. A hard time seeing when I look at the news that God's in control of this. He is. His providence works all through the background. And again, according to his plans and his purposes. Not our plans, not our purposes, but his. Right? And we realize that his plans are always better than anything we ever think of, and that's not a prosperity deal that God's going to just bless you with a bunch of riches. But I mean, the trusting in God in the day-to-day. You trust in God every day. Let's pray.